For 24 Flix, I am Kat Vasquez here at the International Christian Music and Film Festival in Orlando. We're so excited to have Mr. Tyler Smith, film critic and podcast host, here with us today. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming and sharing at your workshop earlier. Can you speak a little bit about what you shared this morning?
Yeah, so I, along with being a film critic, I'm also a college professor, and I teach film history and aesthetics. And so a couple of years ago, I taught a class on film history and then another on film analysis. And this year, they brought me back for the history class. And so, yeah, I just talked about the way film has evolved over time. It's something that, if I'm being honest, I feel like a lot of Christian filmmakers, like, they really want to make movies, but they don't really have much of a sense of where movies started or how they got here. And so I just do like a quick primer on that and give them handouts on like some really great movies to go and see. Because I think the best education that you can get is to just watch movies, like lots of movies. Yep. Mm-hmm. So I try to, if nothing else, I want people to come away having gotten some good recommendations out of it.
And that makes sense. Just do your research and watch some movies, right?
I think so.
Yeah. So how early on did you recognize, or maybe even your loved ones recognize, that you had a thing for movies?
I mean, it's been my whole life, really. I was raised in what I call a movie positive family. My parents were they loved movies. We liked going to movies together. And then probably like 7th or 8th grade. You know what? It was 8th grade, because I have a very specific memory of I looked at the movies that were coming out that were aimed at people my age. And I was like, these are not very good. What else is there? And so I started watching like older movies, and that's when I was like, oh, I take this more seriously than other people. This is a bigger deal for me, because like I would try and recommend like classic movies, like my friends, like, I just watched this movie, The Maltese Falcon, you should check it out. And they watch it like, that was really boring. And I was just like, oh yeah, I guess I'm alone on this.
I have seen that one. You and me, we're like the only two in our generation, I feel like.
Well, I don't know if I go that far, but yeah, it's so I think just recognizing film sort of as an art form and as something more than just entertainment. Not that there's anything wrong with entertainment, obviously, but that there can be a lot more to it. I think that probably started in like 8th grade, and then I just started drinking in film. I watched as many as I could. And that usually is what I wind up recommending to people, is just, as we said before, just watch a lot of movies. If you're gonna make movies, watch lots of movies.
So as a film critic, give us kind of that fly on the wall experience. What would your inner monologue be when you are screening a movie?
I'll be honest, I consider myself actually pretty fortunate, because I know a number of other critics, and they feel like they need to make notes, otherwise they might not remember anything. And they because of what they do for a living, they kind of keep themselves at a distance so that they can be judging the film while it's happening. And that's fine, but I feel like I've always been able to just give myself over to a movie while it's happening, and then my thoughts form afterwards. And I'm very grateful. Like, I didn't do anything to make that happen, but I'm just very grateful that I'm still able to get lost in a movie. And so while I'm watching a movie, granted, if it's bad, then yes, I'm on the outside judging it the whole time. But if it's good, I'm able to just sort of let myself go. And I think frankly, that's another thing that I would recommend to people, whether they be critics or writers or directors, is yes, obviously you want to learn something from these movies as far as filmmaking, but don't be afraid to just let yourself be an audience member first, and just let it impact you the way that it's going to. Because when you go to make a movie, you might be able to make something that is like objectively, formally good, but it's not connecting with anybody emotionally, because you kind of cut yourself off from that as a viewer. And so it's something that I feel fortunate to experience as a critic, is the ability to just let a movie wash over me, instead of just be constantly thinking while it's happening. Unless it's bad, of course, in which case it is not bringing me in at all.
us a little bit about Battleship Potemkin.
Yeah, all right. So Battleship Potemkin, which for those that don't know is a pun on the Russian silent film Battleship Potemkin, started in 2007. My co-host and I, at the time, there were movie podcasts, but not very many of them, and we thought that there was a bit of a gap there that we thought we could fill, so we started the show, and we lived in Los Angeles, so we were able to have like actors and writers and directors and comedians on the show, which I think set us sort of apart from other podcasts. And it's a topic-based show. Like, we don't necessarily review new movies. We just talk about something having to, every week talk about something having to do with movies. Like a recent episode is a profile on Christopher Plummer, who's an actor who passed away recently, and just kind of talking about his career.
He was my first crush. Okay, so yes,
Okay.
that throws me back to our comment. I love those classic movies.
Sure.
Yeah, big fan of his
Sound
work.
of Music. He was a good-looking guy, and but also was very charismatic. And so, like, to devote an entire episode to him and talking about older movies and newer movies, he was acting right up until the end. Like, that was really exciting for us. And then sometimes we get really film nerdy about it and just talk about like what does this is really academic, but like, what even is a movie anymore? Like, in an age of like YouTube videos, like somebody could make a 10-minute YouTube video and put more thought into that than somebody making a 2-hour
Go
film.
there,
So
Tyler. Come on, preach.
So what even counts as a movie anymore? And I think the answer is I don't know. And then you have people arguing, like I remember Martin Scorsese, a wonderful director, was talking about the Marvel films and saying they're not cinema. It's like, okay, so what does cinema mean? And we know what movies are. These are definitely movies, but are they cinema? And so we enjoy having those kind of conversations, which admittedly limits our audience a little bit, but the people that are fans are like hardcore film fans. And so that's who we cater to.
Well, you hit on a very important and relative topic because of YouTube, virtual platforms, everything is changing.
Yeah.
So what are those trends that concern you a bit?
I do think that, because we live partially, or maybe especially because of the lockdown, like, we really live in like the age of streaming. And there are so many streaming services. And most streaming services, they just need content. They need to be offering something new every week, which is fine, but when you're just desperate for anything, you'll green light anything. And movies that frankly might not be that good suddenly have a platform for people to see them, and it might not actually, and in a way it sort of devalues good movies. When good movies are given the same platform as bad movies, which admittedly in the movie theater that's what happens as well, then suddenly everything becomes just, then there's no such thing as good and bad. It's literally, it's kind of a common thing to say. It's like, well, everything's just content now. It's like, yes, but what about the role of like, does a streaming service have a responsibility to champion stuff that its creators believe to be good? So it is, another conversation is coming about in the critic community about the role of like a curator. For a streaming service, like, yes, we have a lot of stuff, but maybe we should be focusing on quality instead of quantity. Like, instead of having 1,000 movies, maybe we have 500 movies, but those movies are good. Like, we believe those movies to be good. So, we're still kind of in this place of transition, but there are so many streaming services out right now, and each of them are just trying to get as much content as they can, and I feel like there's not a lot of discernment when you're doing that.
Well, also, as a filmmaker myself, how do you do that without a lot of funding, right? Set yourself apart, because you've got to have that piece to stand out.
It all depends on the kind of movie that you want to make. Documentaries certainly can be made for a little bit less money. But as far as narratives, one thing that I'll say is a good script costs as much to write as a bad script. So granted, it costs time because you got to do multiple drafts, but usually movies start going wrong with the script. So making sure that script is as good as it can be, it's like, all right, now we need good actors to make that work. but then we also need to make sure that they are shot well and that we can hear them. So like it really, I mean, some of the best movies ever made are not that technically astounding. Like in the world of independent film, I'm a big fan of a guy named John Cassavetes, who was an actor. He acted in Rosemary's Baby and The Dirty Dozen, but he was also a filmmaker, and so he would take the money that he made from acting and put it into these movies, but the budgets were still incredibly low. He shot in his house with his friends, and it wasn't like, there weren't like a lot of lights, it wasn't really stylistic, it was really just about the actors and the dialogue, and the camera and sound was just about capturing that. And so you can make a great movie as long that's just technically proficient, but it's really focusing on how good the script is and how well it's being delivered. So it really all depends on the kind of movie you want to make. If you want to make Lord of the Rings, that's gonna cost money, and you need to realize that.
Starts with the script.
It starts with the script, but also I think looking at what your possible technical limitations are comes into play. Because ambition is a good thing, but you also need to recognize where your limitations are.
We're here at the International Christian Film and Music Festival.
There we go.
So, where do you think Christian cinema could get better? How could we change some things?
I think it could get better in every possible way. There are maybe a handful of Christian films that I've seen that I've thought are pretty good. There are many, many more that I think are borderline unwatchable. And I hate putting it that way, but it's like, I'm a film fan, I'm also a Christian, and most Christian films I feel like don't do either of those well. And I think a lot of it ultimately comes down to intentionality. I think a Christian filmmaker, they feel like, well, my intentions are good. I want to try and spread God's word. Perfectly fine motivation, but that usually is where it stops. And they think like, well, because I want to do good, God will certainly bless this film, right? And meanwhile, they'll write one draft of their script, they'll cast actors who are available, but they don't really work for the script, and then they don't shoot it well or whatever it is, but either they don't know that what they're making is bad, or they don't care, because for them, it's all about getting a message across, and how they get that message across really doesn't matter that much. And so I do feel like most of the films are just really bad because Christians aren't approaching film as an art form, they're approaching it as a ministry tool. And those are very different things. Meanwhile, if you approach it as an art form and you appreciate it in that way, you will probably be more effective in your ministry than if you put that to the side and just treated it as a ministry tool, which is kind of ironic.
No, that is wisdom. You got to have the balance to be relevant. Yeah, absolutely. Where do you see cinema going in the future? We just spoke about virtual platforms.
Yeah.
The stream is widening to the ocean. Everybody's in its content.
Yeah.
What does this spell for cinema?
Christian cinema or cinema in general?
In general.
I mean, obviously, like, streaming is bigger than it's ever been, and I think a big part of that is because of the pandemic and the lockdown and movie theaters being closed. There were a lot of people that were saying like, well, this harbors the death of movie theaters, because once people realize they can watch, once they are locked into like watching movies in their home, that even once movie theaters open, people aren't going to want to go. And I don't agree with that. I think they still associate films with like a big experience that you go out into a movie theater to see. And while some theaters have closed, which is unfortunate, you hear stories about like, oh, this theater opened or that theater opened, and sure enough, like Godzilla vs. Kong started selling out. It's not a good movie, but people didn't care. It's a big movie, and they felt I should see this in a big theater. Mm-hmm. And I think
it was worth it.
I saw it in the theater.
Boys.
Yeah, oh, of course.
It went crazy.
Yeah, I saw it in the theater and I enjoyed it, and I was glad. It's like, yeah, there is an argument to be made that movies, at least certain movies, are meant to be seen that way. And so I genuinely, when people say like, oh, this is the end of theater going, it's like, you'd be shocked how many people, even without realizing it, value the cinematic aspect of film. And when you watch something at home, there's nothing wrong with that, but it makes everything smaller, and it puts everything on the same level. Suddenly, watching Godzilla vs. Kong is on par with watching The Office. It's like they're very different animals. And so I do think that as things open up and once everything is kind of done as far as the lockdown, I do think that people will return to cinemas and will be very excited to do so. But that doesn't mean that streaming is going to go away. I think you're starting to see with release schedules, you'll start to see a lot more of that dual thing of like a movie being released in theaters and on a certain streaming service, and so people can choose what they want to do. But it is good news in many ways. But it'll be interesting. I do think it's possible that theater-going prices will go down as a way to try and bring people back. But it's hard to know how big it's going to have a huge impact. But it's hard to know just how big that impact is going to be and what it's going to be for probably another few years. Like as we're looking back, we'll be able to say definitively, like, this is what it was before, this is what it was after, and I think we know why.
Okay. All right, Tyler. So film critic, podcast host, but also new dad.
Yes.
8-month-old twins. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you very much. This is like the first time I've been out of the house in a while, and I was looking forward to it, and then the minute I got on the plane, I was like, I just want to snuggle. No, I just want to snuggle with my kids.
Oh,
you know?
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got such a great heart. Appreciate your time. One last question.
Yeah.
What do you want Tyler Smith to be known for?
Oh, jeez, that's like existential. Okay. I would like to be known. I mean, putting aside the idea of like, obviously, I want to be a good husband, a good father, and I want to like represent Christ well in the world. But from like a career standpoint, I want to be known as someone who pointed people towards good movies. I think it's very possible for professors, for critics, to make it very much about themselves, and I do it too. We all do it, and you can't help it because you're bringing yourself to the conversation, which is fine. But in the end, I do think it should be about the movies. And if I get to the end of my career and people say, "Hey, I would never have known about this great movie if not for you," I would say, I'm glad that I was able to do that for you, but I'm also glad that you saw that movie that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So, like, it's nice to get that acknowledgement, but in the end, it should be about the movies.
Appreciate your honesty. Tyler, it's an honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. For 24 Flix, I'm Kat Vasquez.